All right. Well, we appear to have we just lost someone, but we appear to have a critical mass nonetheless. So welcome everyone to another GitBOM community meeting. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, I disabled screen sharing. Let me re-enable it on the other computer, which is running the GitBOM infra thing. Let's see here. There we go. That should do it. Let's try this again. There we are. All right. And let's go ahead and get started. As a reminder, if you haven't already, please go ahead and put your name, company, and pronouns in the attendees list. And I'm glancing through the names. Is there anyone here it's their first or second GitBOM community meeting?
It's my second.
Hey, Andrew. Do you want to do just a very quick reintro?
Sure. Yeah. So I work on software supply chain security at MITRE. I think last time I mentioned that I'm working on a thing called Cargo SPDX that generates an SPDX SBOM for cargo crates, Rust crates. So yeah, and Nell saw that and invited me. So I'm glad to be here.
Awesome.
So a brief mention on the SPDX thing, since it's currently on top. We did finally merge the Gitoid piece of the SPDX 2.3.
Sweet.
Back to you now.
Yeah, no worries. Anyone else? I'm not sure who MRDR is.
Oh, hi, this is Marcos.
Hello. Good to hear from you.
Yes, sorry, I put my name on MRDR.
Oh, no worries.
Yep. I'm in Cisco.
Awesome.
I presented myself last week. Yep.
Well, it's great to have you here again.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right. I think everyone else has been here at least a few times. So let's go ahead and get started. Gentle reminder to please start reaching out to language and build tool communities that you have contact with. Any updates on this, Ed? Oh, and this is for Ed to present, not me. So Ed, over to you. Yeah.
It's okay. It's intentionally designed to be easy to present for anyone to present. It's not a very Ed specific thing, but effectively, this is just our tracking spreadsheet for tracking who's reaching out to which open source communities. You can put down your name as a contact for that community on the GitBOM side. If there is someone who is consented to be listed on the community contact side, that's fantastic. And then sort of the status and where things are. We've had a bunch of other things floating around here and various people who have been kind enough to step up and add their names as contacts on these and various degrees of board evolution.
Awesome. All right.
So if there's anything folks would like to say about readouts of how this has progressed or things to add, even if they don't necessarily know, it's just a community thing. Actually, one I should probably add here, because it came up today, was someone brought up that we should probably be reaching out to PHP.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Does anyone have contacts in the PHP community?
I did, but I think they dropped me from the core list a long time ago.
Well, let's keep an ear out on that. David, what's up?
So this is actually on the agenda for this week, but I wanted to raise it now as well. Most of the folks from Sneak are either in Europe or Israel and are finding this meeting time a little bit difficult.
Gotcha.
So we can probably improve attendance for Europeans if we move things up. Also on the JVM side, through Patrick Chenazon, who's DevRel at Microsoft, he connected me to a bunch of Microsoft OpenJDK people. We're trying to schedule a meeting to chit chat about stuff. I will also make sure that they are aware of the GitBOM community meeting and maybe just drag them in here so we don't have to coordinate a meeting. I have not done anything with the Scala folks, but we'll put that on my to-do list and try to get it done by next week.
Awesome.
One other quick point though, this was the call time came up last week on the agenda. I don't see it on this week's agenda. So please do feel free to add it. Oh, it is actually in the new conversations. You may want to bump it up out of the new conversations just to make sure we cover it.
All right. Cool. Anything else on build tools and communities? Hearing none, let's go ahead and go on to the next item in the agenda, which is the rule of two, handle SHA-1, SHA-256 gitoids using, we reached consensus, jazz hands for that, on dual parallel trees. Looks like DPP brought up Perl as a relevant standard. Oh, well, that's for distinguishing between artifact IDs and GitBOM Docs. Ed, is there more to discuss on the dual parallel trees?
Yeah, so this was partially left at a ruminate stage when we discussed it last. And so I had gone back through the recordings to try and get a sense of whether we had actually achieved consensus, because I know that we definitely decided we were going to ruminate. There was, from looking at the recording, and please, anyone feel free to correct me, it did seem like we had at least reached somewhat consensus on ruling out just trying to intuit things from the length of hashes. So we at least know one thing that we don't like as an approach to this problem. But given that we had ruminated on it, it seemed like a good idea to revisit because we hadn't come to a definite conclusion in the last conversation. Do folks want me to sort of hum a few bars to remind everyone where we were?
Why don't you go ahead and do that, Ed?
Okay. Certainly. So effectively, what's going on with this is that once we've made the decision to go with dual artifact trees, and by dual trees, we mean that because people have some concerns about SHA-1, and there's also some concern about forward evolution of hash function. And while Git supports SHA-256, it is very little deployed. We are going to, at the beginning at least, run what we call dual tree, which is that we have an entirely SHA-1 gitoid tree and a completely separate, entirely gitoid SHA-256 tree, and we'll just run both of them in parallel with each other. And we come to some consensus around that, but once you've come to that consensus, the very first question is, how do I tell which kind of GitBOM doc I'm looking at? Because we no longer have the one true hash. And so I sat down and made 3 proposals for ways we could address this. And please note, we're very open to others. These are just 3 that occurred to me. And I listed out some of the pros and cons that I saw to them. And again, people are more than welcome to contribute their own pros and cons because mine are not by any means exhaustive. The one I think we decided we didn't like last time, which is the very first one on the list, which is distinguishing by artifact ID length. Now, this happens to work for SHA-1 and SHA-256, but it's not a good forward-looking, reliable way of approaching the problem because we may have whatever comes after SHA-256 may have the same hash length, in which case you're broken, you got no way to tell. So did I remember correctly that no one likes artifact ID length as a tool for this?
I believe
awesome.
So.
The second one that we looked at was distinguishing by a per artifact ID URI, right? So right now, the current state of things is we've got blob space artifact ID space bomb space GitBOM ID with a new line terminated record. That's sort of the record format that we're looking at in the GitBOM doc currently. And so this proposal would be to prefix the artifact ID and the GitBOM ID with the gitoid blob and the SHA type URI. So it was very clear, hash by hash, which one we were looking at. Is that tickling everyone's memory?
Yes.
Cool. And again, it has some cons. It bloats out the size of the file. It also opens up the possibility of mixed hash GitBOM files. And my recollection was that we generally didn't want that. That way seemed like a very bad idea. And then there were a whole bunch of discussions last time about reparability and whatnot. So I will settle down here because it sounds like Jeremy's got a comment.
Over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, so a problem that we haven't discussed occurred to me, or at least I don't know that we've discussed it, which is if you have a dual tree of both SHA-1 and SHA-256, how do you know what the correspondence between the nodes and the two graphs is? Like, how do you know which SHA-256 corresponds to, like, what the corresponding SHA-1 for a SHA-256 node is?
The short answer is as currently envisioned, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but currently we have nothing envisioned whereby you would be able to tell the correspondence between the two, because the file format is lexically ordered, and so the order in which they appear does not necessarily tell you anything about which is which. Doesn't mean we shouldn't, doesn't mean it's not an important problem, but you are correct, it's not a problem that we've given much consideration to.
Because even if you can't find the exact correspondence, it seems to me like it would be important to be able to demonstrate that two graphs are actually equivalent. Like if someone claims that I've got these two graphs, that here's the SHA-256 and here's the SHA-1, and I purport that they're of the same thing, it would be nice to be able to actually check that for yourself somehow, or be able to, like, I mean, you could do obvious things like if the graphs have different numbers of nodes in them or different topology, then clearly they're not the same thing. But I don't know, like that, maybe that's sufficient. But I think, I mean, one way that you can at least, if the identities are embedded in the artifacts themselves, no, I don't know. Let me just leave that as yet to be discussed thing, and we can work out when to do it.
Let's go to Andrew and then David.
So I know you mentioned the mention of lexical ordering. If the ordering were topological, would that be sufficient for being able to have a correspondence between the two?
Could you say more about what you mean by topological in this case?
Right. I mean, so if it's representing it's a directed acyclic graph. If you had basically a sorting from some sort of agreed upon between the two of them starting point, and then had a sort such that the basically edges that where my long time since I've actually done this stuff comes up, but basically where the ordering of the edges in terms of the directionality of them is taken into account for the sorting, so that there's a sense in which they are ordered relative to the way in which they would be traversed, or like sort of the dependencies between them is encoded in the sorting of them in the actual output file. Is that sufficient for them being able to say, okay, the two that are, let's say that's a line equivalent. So like if it's on line 15 in one file, it's the same as the one that's on line 15 in the other file.
The issue is that if you say have a build step that's got 10 inputs, then as far as the GitBOM representation is concerned, those 10 inputs are like, we don't know anything else about them other than those 10 inputs and what their identities are.
Right.
But
okay.
we don't have file names and there's no intrinsic order for those. So
Okay.
sorting by hash is the closest that we have to some, like if we didn't sort by anything, then any ordering of those 10 inputs would be equivalent, but they'd all hash differently. And so we want to have a canonical ordering so that everyone can agree on how to hash that. Mm-hmm. But if it's ordered by hash ID, then obviously that's random as far as their actual purpose in the build is concerned.
Yeah, fair point. All right, so that doesn't work.
David, over to you.
So I think there are a couple of things that we could think about. First of all, we could have a cross-reference between hashes within kind of the enclosing document. So I'm imagining that there's going to be an enclosing document that says, this is a file. Let's say it's, foo.java. And, foo.java has hash X, SHA-1 Gitoid hash 123, and SHA-256 Gitoid hash 456. So in that, when we store that in the SHA-256 table, that's going to be an identical document. So it's going to reference both the SHA-1 and the SHA-256. And, you know, as we think about the documents that are descriptive of the thing, and those documents may also include the Git hash and maybe the Git tree that the particular file came from, a bunch of other data around. And we haven't really talked a lot about the metadata files or that sort of thing, but I would see kind of the dual cross-reference in that document itself. The second thing that we could potentially do is also include a zero knowledge attestation that there was an observation of both the SHA-1 and SHA-256 Gitoids. And that attestation should also correspond between the two trees. And you know, I'm not saying one or the other, potentially both, depending on, you know, how belt and suspenders we want to be. Does that resonate well with anybody, or am I kind of overthinking the problem?
I mean, for the first thing, like as soon as you have a document that mentions both kinds of hash, the question arises whether that document itself is part of the Merkle tree, like if it's hashed or not. And if it is, then it effectively is going back to the other proposal where you have the combined trees with the corresponding downsides. And if it isn't, then I don't quite see how it fits in.
So I kind of had heard that as a suggestion around metadata, which is the correspondence of these hashes could be treated as metadata, because you're essentially asserting, hey, I know it's metadata that, you know, on my file system, this is where I put the file, and this is what its hashes, what its Git, you know, basically what its Gitoid SHA-1 and Gitoid SHA-256 IDs were. And of course, metadata not going into the Merkle tree, that could be information that's passed along. But again, part of what it is, you know, what it really comes down to is sort of figuring out what the use cases look like for being able to correspond those two. Because it tickles my brain as potentially being important, but I can't quite put my finger on the root of the importance yet, if that makes sense.
Well, so the putting the metadata in the tree, I think we have to do that. But then the question is the metadata part of the graph, or is the metadata a pointer to a node in the graph, which would also imply that the metadata that's a pointer to a node in the graph would necessarily have to, we would have to build a graph system where we can do bidirectional traversal. So you go from, sorry.
Yeah, but by way of precision, just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, when one talks about putting data in the Merkle tree, we're talking about that being something that's hashed over as part of the Merkle tree, which right now we're keeping extremely sparse. It almost sounded to me like you were talking when you said, I think we have to put metadata in the tree. What you're really talking about is, I think there is metadata that should refer into the tree that we probably want to distribute with the Merkle tree, right? With the graph.
I'm actually suggesting that it is part of the graph.
So the tricky part with that is you have to be careful about the ephemeralness of data when you do that, right? So if you're putting into the graph metadata that includes the file name on your local file system, all bets are off.
So that once again, it depends on where that information resides in the tree or the graph. In other words, if it is a pointer into the file, you might have 7 different pieces of metadata that point to the same file, or that point to the same, substantive. If you create a Gitoid for foo.java, and then you have a bunch of different metadata pieces that point to it, that would still have metadata in a tree, but the Merkleness of the foo.java and all of the things that are part of the bar package, of which foo is one file, would be preserved.
Yeah, this is where I'm getting to the precision of expression, because I think what I'm hearing you say is you're thinking in a much broader sense around the graph, right? Your conceptualization of the graph, qua the graph, includes any kind of other thing that may be pointing into the GitBOM artifact dependency graph itself, right? So if I have a metadata file that has a reference to an artifact, then that metadata file, in the way you're thinking about the graph, is part of the graph. And that's actually not technically incorrect if you conceptualize the graph as the broader array of things that may be nodes that have edges that point to stuff. But there's this very narrow sense around the artifact dependency graph, where we're talking about the things that are represented in a GitBOM document. In other words, the things that get hashed into the GitBOM document itself, where I think we have to be careful about the precision of what we mean.
Okay. So maybe for next meeting, we can actually have examples of what you're thinking of for GitBOM document. And I'll try to put together what I'm thinking of for metadata, and maybe we do a compare and contrast.
Sounds perfect.
I mean, I think the specific concrete question that you would need to answer is like, what is the name? Like, how is this metadata represented? How is it named? Like, does it have Git OIDs? Does it have some other identifier? Because I think that the answer to that concretely determines where this metadata lives in the overall data model.
Well, in the spirit of yes and for that, Jeremy, how that metadata is identified, definitely an important thing, but also what other entities in the model you identify it, right? So for example, if I am a GitBOM document, I am identifying artifacts that are descendants in the graph, and I'm also identifying the GitBOM documents of those artifacts, right? I'm identifying inputs to the build process, and I'm identifying, the GitBOM documents of those inputs. And those are the only two kinds of things that we currently have been talking about identifying in the GitBOM file itself. If you're talking about identifying metadata, even if you're identifying it by Gitoids, if you're identifying it in other places that are not the GitBOM document itself, that's very much a no harm, no foul situation in terms of the preservation of the artifact dependency graph.
In the interest of, because we're about halfway through the meeting now, in the interest of continuing with the rest of our agenda, I propose, sounds like there's some async work to be done, and that perhaps these conversations continue on the GitHub or GitHub issue, and we can revisit it next week or a week after next.
Actually, if I could come back quickly, because
Sure.
these are sort of slightly orthogonal to this particular issue.
Right.
So it's sort of rooted in Jeremy having had a stray thought, which may or may not be interesting and important. Is it fair to say, Jeremy, that it sort of also tickles your brain as potentially important, but the concreteness is not quite there?
Yeah, that's probably a reasonable summary.
Okay, but what we haven't really discussed at all yet is this actual issue about how we would like to handle distinguishing between GitBOM documents.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, and the sort of two options on the table currently, and we're open to others, are either you have a per hash URI prefix, which is the one we were discussing when we sort of went off to the one side a little bit, or the other is to have a GitBOM document header, where at the very beginning of the file, you essentially say, hi, I'm a GitBOM document, and this is the URI scheme of the artifact IDs in the new line terminated. And then from there on out, we just continue the way we had been, not telling you hash by hash which kind it is, because we said that at the beginning. Does that make sense so far?
It does.
It has the advantage of being compact. It's flexible because you could use it for any kind of future artifact ID. It doesn't encourage mixed hash trees. It also gives you file magic. And file magic is sometimes super helpful to tell what the hell kind of thing you're dealing with. It does sort of have the con of adding a header to the file, which is a little bit more complex. But that was sort of the other idea that came up.
I do like having the header for the file magic things, particularly as we're talking about trying to integrate GitBOM into compilers. Jeremy, it sounded like you were starting to say something, so over to you.
I was just going to say, if we're absolutely certain that we never want to have mixed hash graphs, which I'm definitely in favor of not allowing, then I really think there's a strength in having a representation that cannot represent a bad state. So if you cannot represent a mixed hash graph, then that's a big positive.
Any other thoughts around per artifact ID versus by GitBOM doc header?
So I know we had folks who weighed in last time with various opinions, and certainly we don't necessarily have to repeat those, although you're welcome to. I'm trying to get a sense of where we stand on consensus so I can know what to go draft a pull request for of these two proposals. Do folks have sort of a general sense or feeling? It sounds like Jeremy is generally in favor of headers. I'm sorry, Null, I've forgotten. I think you're also generally in favor of headers.
That's correct.
Do other folks have opinions they want to sort of, voice?
Andrew just unmuted his mic, and then let's go to David.
I think I'm still in favor of headers, mostly because of sort of not encouraging the kind of mix of SHA-1 and SHA-256.
Gotcha. And David, over to you.
I am biased against headers because I'm biased towards each line representing itself rather than having to keep the state of the file around while processing. But it's not strongly held, and it seems that there are a lot of strongly held opinions. So, consider this a weekly held slight bias.
Understood.
Your functionalness is showing, Dave.
It often does.
Are there any objections to perhaps Ed proceeding with drafting a pull request based on distinguishing by GitBOM doc header? I hear none. So I think that might be the general consensus here, Ed.
Okay. Got it. Perfect. I will take a note here and definitely get that for us for next time.
Sounds good. All right. Distinguishing between artifact ID types in ELF file section names. I think this was something we discussed letting marinate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to sort of refresh folks' memory from last time, this was the second thing that came to mind if we're going to do dual tree, which is how do we, previously we've been talking about in something like an ELF file embedding in with an ELF file section name, something like .bomb. And obviously if we have multiple dual tree, we need to decide how we're going to represent dual tree when embedding into ELF files. And so I sort of, again, cobbled together a number of solutions. None of these are, if you have other solutions, we're certainly open to them. And sort of my very narrow view of pros and cons, and I'm sure there are other pros and other cons that people can look at here. Does the nature of the problem make sense to everyone? Okay, so the first proposal I put together was to suggest that we just put .gitbom : in the artifact ID scheme, very analogous to the header approach for the documents themselves. And so for dual tree, you'd have two ELF sections, one named .gitbom : gitoid : blob : SHA-1, the other one ending in SHA-256. And you would simply put the hash value into the corresponding ELF section. Now, this is, consistent with the way we're talking about the file headers, which is nice. It's flexible because you can independently add other artifact types, ID types over time. So for example, I know, Jeremy, I've gotten the sense that you might find it interesting to also run in parallel something with Blake. the separability of headers here hopefully would make that more convenient to do. But those are some of the thoughts. And the con here is that it's a bit non-idiomatic. Generally speaking, you don't put colons into else section names. I mean, you could, but I don't think I've ever seen it in the wild. Has anyone else ever seen colons in else section names in the wild?
No, I was going to make that same comment. Like dot would be much more common.
Yeah, and that's exactly the first sort of con on the not idiomatic. I'm an enormous respecter of idioms because eventually idioms start bleeding over into quasi-respected contracts in ways that you don't understand, don't expect. And then the other thing that I mentioned here is what I call the generalization issue, which is basically if we'd like to be relatively consistent across different places, right? We'd like to have the same name that we use for ELF files as we use when we're dropping things into archives, et cetera, then using colon becomes an issue because to begin with, last time I checked, colon's an unacceptable character in Windows for a path segment. It's no bueno. Even in POSIX, where it is absolutely legal, it's super odd. Like it just doesn't usually happen. And of course, then you also have the potential for shell tab completion issues with .getBOM and .get that various folks were concerned about if we were to try and make this consistent in archive formats. Oh, I did not realize that colon was the path separator for macOS less than 9. That would also be all kinds of comedy. So the second suggestion I made was to take the same approach, but replace the colon with a dot. So that you essentially are taking roughly the same scheme, but using a different delimiter. So .getBOM, .getoid, .blob, .sha1 as the ELF section name. That tends to be, that tends to be very flexible. It would still run into the .getBOM tab completion issue that we were concerned about.
I don't think tab completion on ELF sections is super important.
No, not on ELF sections, but if we were to try and be somewhat consistent, right? If we were to say, okay, we're going to use this for the ELF section name, we'd like to also use this for the archive entry name that we use to hold the GitBOM in an archive of some sort. Then your archives typically unpack to files, et cetera, et cetera. It's potentially less annoying than building it into your build tree, but it seemed worth calling out just for consideration.
And just quick question, was this by any chance a copy paste from above?
That looks like it might be at least in part copy pasta. Yes.
Okay, gotcha. David, go ahead.
So this is a little bit orthogonal to the specific question, but if we're going to compute the getoid for an ELF file, we're going to then modify the ELF file with one or both of the ELF sections. What happens if another build tool adds another ELF section after we've calculated? How can we then say, these are the steps that you have, or these are the pieces of the ELF file that you have to remove to validate that the SHA is correct or that the getoid is correct?
So this is part of the reason that currently GitBOM sort of, when you embed these IDs into an artifact, they're pointing just down the dependency graph. They never point up, because I've had enough bad experiences with formats where you have to be able to correctly clip things out before you hash them, that it is the hashed, if you have an artifact that contains these sections as an input to your next step, say it's the .o file, and it's got both of these ELF sections, and that's the .o file that your linker consumes, then that entire .o file, including these sections, is what gets hashed. And that's what your linker represents in the GitBOM file that it generates for the thing that it is linked.
Okay, I get that, but if a tool inserts the SHAs into the .o file, what is the SHA? What is the thing of which the SHA is being computed? In other words, can
It's
I
the SHA of the
validate?
GitBOM. It's the SHA of the GitBOM document, not the SHA of the artifact.
Okay.
Jeremy, back to you.
I mean, this proposal, like to David's point, if both of these sections are present in the ELF file, and so then any subsequent consumer of that ELF file will also include the hash of both of these documents, it does have the effect of tying the two graphs together. Like you couldn't retroactively add a new hash without breaking all the existing graphs. So by embedding the documents in the ELF file itself, you are unavoidably coupling the two graphs together. And that kind of brings with it all the same problems. I mean, I think this is a fairly fundamental design point of GitBOM, though, that the fact that the bombs are embedded in the documents, in the like the documents are embedded in the artifacts themselves, means that the relationship between the GitBOM documents and the artifacts is very clear because it's embedded. But it does mean that you can't do any kind of retroactive GitBOM stuff. You can't retroactively add a GitBOM to a previously existing build system or built artifact.
So let's talk through that. Yeah, so I've added that to the future conversations list because I think it's an interesting thing, but I haven't fully sorted that out of my head yet.
I mean, one of the fundamentals of the GitBOM design is that these GitBOM documents are not in themselves representative of a build step or a build artifact. They represent a set of inputs. And so the fact that you embed a GitBOM document in an artifact is the only clue that you have that that artifact is the output of a process for which the inputs were the artifacts listed in the GitBOM document that is embedded in it. Yes, I think I got that right.
Well, really quickly, just to be clear, we're currently the current proposal is to embed the identity, basically the gitoid of the GitBOM document, not the GitBOM document itself.
I mean, that's moot. I mean, they're equivalent.
It is completely irrelevant to your point, but I have had people get confused about that point and worry about binary bloat.
To be honest, I was not clear on that as well. I was actually assuming these ELF sections contained the entire document, not just a reference to it. But as you say, it's moot.
That is entirely potentially open to discussion if we'd like to open that discussion. Either now or at some subsequent time. But as currently envisioned, it was embedding the identity of the GitBOM documents, basically the gitoid of the GitBOM document. So you have the reference rather than the entire document.
But yeah, I mean, my point is separate from that, which is just that because the GitBOM documents themselves don't represent a build step and they don't represent an output artifact, the embedding is the only way that you know what output artifacts were a result of a certain input. And there's still no information about what the process was that generated that artifact from those inputs.
And understood, definitely.
So how are people feeling about these three options? Or is there one that stands out that might work better based on people's context?
I mean, to be honest, there's not actually a huge, like we may as well just have a single GitBOM section that contains a list of distinct GitBOM URIs, because having them as separate sections doesn't actually give you anything. like, because you can't modify the ELF file without breaking any of its downstream consumers anyway. So it's not like you can go and retroactively add a new section transparently or anything like that. So having them as a single section just called .gitbom, which contains a set of Gitto IDs for each different hash type, seems like actually the simplest way of going.
Yeah, so this was the third proposal in the list, was essentially going that route. One thing that it came up last time was that it does mean that your tool has to understand any potential gitoids that it finds there. So basically, if I open up a particular section here for .bomb, then I have to basically go through and have some understanding of what the various representations are there. There was some opinion that came in from some tool builders, certainly not all of them, about it being simpler just to have separate sections for each one. But I don't think that was a strong opinion from my recollection. If others remember differently, because the person who expressed that is not here today, please feel free to speak up.
I mean, so long as we don't have either hash names or hashes themselves with new lines in them, it seems like you would be able to parse the file and then skip over any entry you didn't understand pretty easily.
Fair.
Are we
So
forming? Oh, go ahead, Jeremy. I'm sorry.
So just from a ELF kind of consistency perspective, I think arrays of zero separated things might be a little more idiomatic, but I don't really have a strong opinion about that.
And I presume then we would have to define a lexical order over the file again, just to make sure that we all agree on how the file should be formed.
Yep.
Sounds like we might be coming to a consensus around option number 3 here. Are there any objections to that? Well, hearing none, I think we have a consensus here.
Okay. Awesome.
Cool. All right. Next up, GitBOM information persistence to file system. This. What is this? I'm not sure what this is. It might be a rendering on my screen.
That I have no idea.
It's like a little goldfish hovering over the gitoid thing here. That's really funny.
It's been there for a while.
That's awesome. We'll leave that there. But let's take a look. Oh, now it moved. So I don't know what's going on. But anyway.
Yeah, this whole thing was basically trying to make a proposal around where we should actually persist. If we're going to persist to the local file system, where we would persist the local data, the GitBOM documents and potentially metadata to the local file system. Now, I know you brought up a point, Jeremy, about wanting this to be if you are going to persist the data to the local file system, because you have some situations where that may be less than ideal. So we didn't want to make this the one true way, but effectively it comes down to look for a GitBOM directory environment variable or potentially some per tool flag to tell you where to go put those. Because if you simply write them into the output directories, then you can wind up with a scatter gather problem, right? If you've got a bunch of different directories, you get a bunch of different .bomb subdirectories with .bomb/objects scattered all over your file system. And that has the potential to make it hard to aggregate things.
Well, it means that any tool that needs to find these GitBOM files doesn't know where to find them. Like, I can't assume that its current directory is the right place. And if it's not the current directory, then where? But back to your earlier point, I would certainly like to see, like, I think this is fine. This discussion is fine to say this is the file system implementation, but I would like to see the sort of like at the higher level, it like there be a sort of like abstract API for accessing GitBOM documents, which enumerates the set of operations that you need to be able to support, and then have the file system implementation for that, and then which also allows for a network service kind of implementation or something like that.
Okay, that's actually fair.
Because I think that the problem with focusing on the file system stuff is that one might accidentally spec in stuff like walk up ... until you find a .bomb directory that just doesn't make any sense for a network service. And so it would be nice to make sure that if you did have that functionality, which could be reasonable, it is encapsulated within a higher level operation, which is, find a document with this ID or something.
And I kind of feel like the API ends up being roughly, write this hash to wherever the store is, and read this hash from wherever the store is. Does that make sense? Whether you're talking about a file system read or write is kind of immaterial.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the thing I talked about a few weeks ago of like, what is the ideal abstract where you have a sort of universal cloud service that contains every GitBOM identity that ever existed that you can always access. Is that the ideal that you're trying to approximate here? In which case, you might have a per host single directory that covers every single build subdirectory that might exist within that host. But that kind of assumes you trust all of the tools not to stomp on each other and to write correct stuff and all that sort of stuff. So you might want to partition that by trust domains or, whatever. So there's a bunch of plain old engineering stuff that you need to solve for this file system interface that's kind of independent of the abstract API that you want to present.
David, to you next.
This is in response to some of Jeremy's abstract queries. My bias would be a write-only API, where you basically said, here's the thing that I want, here's the thing that I want to store. And the API itself would compute the Gitoid. So that would mean that you couldn't stomp on something else, because you would have to, you can only write something that is actually a Gitoid. So in other words, you could only, because the Gitoids are hashes, you could never poison something, because you'd only be overwriting the thing that you're representing anyway. The other thing is, yes, I am very much in favor of having a global repository, ultimately a global repository, of which at certain phases in a build, you would upload to some sort of attestation service to say, I attest that these Gitoids are correct. And you'd have whatever cryptographic checks, yada, 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 that go into it. But ultimately, those pieces would go into a global lookup system. And in the cases of things that are proprietary, in other words, proprietary source code, rather than putting the source code up, you would put a zero knowledge proof that you observed the source code as the thing that you put into the global repository. Jeremy, does that strike you as like useful, not useful? Like, am I kind of addressing some of the concerns that you raised?
I mean, I think if you're talking about processes that are writing to files in a directory, even if it's abstracted through an API, there's nothing that stops an untrustworthy tool from just stomping on stuff. But certainly, since we're talking about a content-addressed store, providing the content and then having the API generate the key, the storage key for that, definitely makes sense. That's the second time you've mentioned zero knowledge proofs in this meeting, and I don't really know enough about them to be able to evaluate what you're proposing. So I wonder if you have a pointer or something like that to exactly how a zero knowledge proof would work in this situation.
Yeah, I will. I'll put something in the community Slack channel.
Yeah, that'd be useful.
And I want to break in here for just a moment. We have about 5 minutes left. I unfortunately have a hard stop at the top of the hour. I do know that time of the call was mentioned earlier as a potentially, if not urgent, emerging issue. David, do you want to speak to that in our last few minutes?
Sure. Most of my product management and engineering coworkers at Sneak are located either in London or in Israel. London is 8 hours ahead of the West Coast, and Israel is 10 hours ahead of the West Coast. If it would be possible to move the meeting up by 2 hours, it would facilitate more attendance from sneakers. And yeah, I definitely want to loop at least a couple of Sneak product managers and engineers into these discussions, because I think it plays well with a lot of the stuff that we're looking at supply chain wise. I think it also works well with being able to take the project and get traction within the OpenSSF to have Microsoft, Cisco, and Sneak behind it. So would it be possible to move the call to perhaps 9 a.m. Pacific rather than 11 a.m. Pacific on Tuesdays?
So speaking purely personally, that would work for me, but I think we want to get a sense from folks more broadly of whether that time would work. And partially for the folks we have, definitely for folks we have on the call. So if anyone has that wouldn't work for, please speak up, but also for some of the folks who may not be here this week, who are regular attendees, we would want to check in with them as well.
Slash
the other
channel.
thing is,
oh, go ahead.
Well, the other thing I would point is you were speaking in terms primarily of getting more sneakers on the call. It coincidentally also makes the call much more friendly to Europe in general and Israel in general. There's a lot more than just the sneakers involved in those time zones.
Yep. We might even be able to lure the OpenJDK Microsoft folks in, and they are located in London as well. And a bunch of the Scala people are Switzerland.
So let me sort of throw this out there. Is there anyone currently on the call for whom 9 a.m. Pacific time would be a problem? And we can sort of expand from there on the Slack channel, but just trying to get a sense of the room.
It's less convenient for me, but it's manageable.
For me, it's fine.
Right. Well, Ed, do you want to start the discussion in Slack after this meeting?
I'd actually prefer someone else did. I am happy to contribute to the community overall, but I sometimes feel like I'm talking too much.
Sounds like David is volunteering, so sounds good. And we definitely want to get Ava's input on this too. And they are currently on a plane, I believe. So it'll be good to get their input and the input of everyone else in the Slack channel.
Okay.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. Any final things people want to bring forth before we close? All right, hearing none, I think we might be okay to go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Looking forward to discussing more things with you next week and in the Slack channel in between. Take care, everyone.